criminal defense lawyer, just retired from the public defender's office in Honolulu, and teach at the University of Hawaii Law School.
Sorry, I was muted there. Good afternoon, students. My name is Anthony Miller. I was an alumni of the program in my senior year of high school. And for the last 10 years, I've been working as a coordinator, helping to organize the competitions in the state of Nevada and helping students and teachers prepare for competition. And this is my first year now stepping down as a coordinator and judging at the national competition. So I'm really excited to be here and hear what you have for us today. Thank you for your time.
And I'm Andy Levy. I'm a trial lawyer from Baltimore, Maryland, and I also teach. Maryland has two law schools, University of Maryland and University of Baltimore, and I alternate semesters between them. We haven't had much occasion to tell people that they may sit on Zoom, so you folks should feel free to sit down if you'd like.
My name's Savannah Keeley.
My name's Connor Olchak.
My name's Eli Avey, and we are seniors at Laurel High School in Mr. Denhaming's Honors Civics class.
And I'm sorry, could you folks repeat your names?
My name's Savannah Keeley.
My name's Connor Olchak.
My name's Eli Avey.
Thank you. And I did see you introduce your teacher, which we appreciate. Okay, as you know, we are doing question 2 of Unit 4 today, which I will read, although I know you are intimately familiar with it. Members of Congress are not only legislators, but they are also inquisitorial and should meet frequently to inspect the conduct of the public officers. And that's a quote attributed to George Mason at the Philadelphia Convention. How effectively do you believe Congress has used its investigatory powers? Explain the differences, if any, between Congress's power to investigate and power of oversight. Which power, in your opinion, is more significant? Finally, how effectively do you believe Congress has used its oversight powers? You may begin.
We believe that there are many cases in which Congress has effectively used its power to investigate. However, most well-known hearings happen after national scandals are exposed to the press and are seldom initiated by Congress without a loud public outcry or heavy political criticism from across the aisle. These investigations are often heavily politicized and accomplishable in reality. However, some investigations are productive, such as the investigation into the Pearl Harbor attack. Despite examples of positive impacts the congressional body has had while investigating cases, there are also many misuses of the investigatory power. An example would be the investigation into Mark Rich's pardon, where Congress questioned the legality of Rich's pardon by President Bill Clinton. When there's a congressional investigation, legislators will often look at their way to support their own party. In this investigation, Representative Henry Waxman insisted that there was no evidence of criminal wrongdoing on the part of Clinton, even though there was enough evidence to warrant concern. Clinton's political party, despite these facts, did bring criminal charges.
Another use of the investigatory power is researching the future effects of proposed legislation and the ramifications of already passed bills. However, this responsibility is rarely upheld, as it would be virtually impossible for them to exercise this power in this capacity. There are only 535 members of Congress, and many large pieces of legislation are passed each year, comprising thousands of pages and regulations. Many times, members don't even know what is physically written in the bills, let alone do they carry out their due diligence in investigating the legislation. This isn't to say that they are at fault for this failure. The scope of the investigations that Congress would have to undertake would be immense, time-consuming, and resource-draining. Congress should use its full power in investigating legislation that has a large impact on the nation. However, if they fully execute this power, it is safe to say that little would get done in a Congress that already gets very little done.
To address the first bullet, the oversight and investigative powers are relatively similar and they typically work together, but they're constitutionally different. The investigative power is used to investigate anything related to the development of public policy, including constituents' opinions, financial allocations, and community impact. In contrast, Congress uses the power of oversight to supervise federal agencies and programs. Although there have been positive outcomes from these investigations, hearings have also been used for less noble purposes, such as the blacklisting of private citizens during the Un-American Activities hearings in the 1950s. To combat issues like this, the Supreme Court has since ruled that Congress must confine itself to legislative purposes and avoid the strict and private affair of individual citizens. While both powers of investigation and oversight are important for the continuation of public policy, the power of investigation is more important, because without it, there would be no form of oversight for Congress to use. The thought that investigative powers are more crucial than the oversight power was also supported by James Wilson, who wrote in an essay in 1774 The members of the Commons were considered grand inquisitors of Rome.
Throughout our history, Congress has used its oversight power effectively in many instances. A notable example was the Church Committee of 1975, where presidential abuses were discovered going back decades. This investigation is a model for how the power should be used, especially in regard to keeping the executive branch from abusing its power. Another example of the oversight power was in 1987, when Congress investigated the Iran-Contra scandal. Even though there are examples of Congress using its oversight power effectively, this power is actually completely underutilized. According to the Federal Register, there are over 430 departments, agencies, and sub-agencies of the federal government, which employ around 3 million people. It is completely unfathomable that we can entrust Congress to fully watch over the executive branch with such a discrepancy in size between the two, while also fulfilling their duties as Congress members. Congress does not always use the power in the intended manner, but to compound an issue, they don't have enough time.
We believe as a group that while Congress has indeed used its power for good and justice has been delivered in many cases on their behalf, their power to investigate has been underutilized and abused for political purposes in other instances. Both of these powers are crucial to the function of Congress in both its main capacity as a legislative body and its capacity as a check on the executive branch. We are now ready for your questions.
Thank you. I'm interested in, if I understood you correctly, you pointed to the 1975 hearings with Senator Church and Iran-Contra as examples of good and appropriate use of congressional oversight. And perhaps you could talk about the Iran-Contra hearings, the length of time they took, the cost involved, and whether they led to specific legislation that would otherwise not have been introduced or discussed or passed.
It was a good use because it actually resulted in many people in the executive branch coming down with different jail sentences, very, very light in many cases, but direct consequences, which we don't often see from a lot of these investigations. I mean, they'll investigate scandals a lot, but very rarely do you see, at least in modern times, actual penalties for these people involved in these scandals. So this is a great example of one of those times where we can see tangible results from these scandals taking place.
As far as like future legislation that it inspired or triggered, there wasn't really much of that we saw in our research, but it just showed that there is things that go on behind the scenes that not all the people see, and that investigation uncovered that and showed that it is good we have that Congress has the power to investigate and find these things out.
So I was interested, your opening statement in which you sort of talked about the hundreds of different agencies and that if anything, the oversight power is underutilized because of just limited, they're just, only so many hours in the day and so many members of Congress. So do you have any proposals for how you think that process or system could be made more efficient?
I think that by reducing the amount of employees that the government has would be a great way of doing that. We could limit the size of those executive agencies and executive branches, and that would be a really good way of helping Congress be able to actually fulfill their duties and having these oversight investigations.
Another on the other side of that, the amount of staffers that each congressional officer has had since like the 1990s has stayed the same. So while the executive agencies have gotten larger and larger and larger, these Congress men and women have had the same amount of staffers. So it's been kind of hard for them to keep track with the same amount of people when these agencies get bigger and bigger and bigger. So we could also give them more resources in the form of staffers and people behind them to carry out these investigations with them.
And some people might be under the opinion that maybe this would make the executive agencies weaker if we limit the size of the people that they employ. However, we think that this would just make them stronger because that would limit the amount of jobs that are useless and that we're essentially wasting money on.
Would you also be in favor, perhaps, in either in addition to or instead of giving Congress members more staffers each, would you be willing to consider adding additional members to Congress, perhaps doubling the size of the Senate or something like that?
In my personal opinion, that probably wouldn't solve the problem because more isn't always better. And just because you have more people in the room working on a problem, that doesn't mean it's going to get solved. There's probably just going to be more confusion and problems and less decision making. And by doubling the Senate, that wouldn't solve it either because there's a reason it's small. We don't want 2 houses of representatives, and adding staffers also probably wouldn't solve the problem either. We need to reduce the size of the government and limit those executive agencies to be more efficient.
Right, and another problem with adding more people, adding staffers, or doubling the size of the Senate is that it would become even more heavily politicized. That was another point that we brought up in our prepared response. Was that another reason other than them just not having enough manpower to complete these investigations is that the investigations are really politicized, and sometimes they'll look over evidence that is really important to these cases in order to support their political party. So I think that this would just encourage this behavior if we added more people doing this.
So I want to respond to that and give you something else to think about and see how you respond to this, if perhaps it changes your opinion or what you would suggest here. You know, Congress is not just there to investigate and oversee the executive branch and the bureaucracy. And I think you've made it clear that that is too large and it makes it very hard for them to deal with. But, you know, as society has grown, as things have become more complex, economic systems become more complex, financial markets, the different types of stocks and securities that exist have become more complex, and more possibilities for corruption exist in the private markets, as well as problems with technology, problems with social media. Congress recently had done inquiries on the tech giants. So this isn't just about the executive bureaucracy. Congress has some responsibility to investigate so that they can inform themselves to make legislation that regulates private markets and corporate interests as well, right? So how do we deal with that?
Today we can see that although we talked about how the oversight power isn't used enough, only about a quarter of congressional committee hearings are actually used for the purpose of overseeing executive agencies. The rest of them are used for investigating pending legislation and bills that are in that committee at that moment. So there is already a lot of this going on at that time. I mean, oversight, we focus on oversight a lot in that second part of it, but in reality, a lot of it is what you were talking about in investigating these bills and regulations and stuff like that. So it already happens in that capacity.
Right, we think
Sure. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
we think that a way that we could even help Congress in that aspect of it, of just simply researching legislation, is by making the bills a lot smaller. So we would encourage ending omnibus bills and having a certain page limit of bills. And we can see that this has worked before because the Environmental Protection Agency in the 1970s passed bills that were 4 pages long. And the reason why they could do that was because they were simple and they were direct.
As far as the tech giants go, there isn't really a good way to break them up other than maybe breaking companies up, but that also creates another problem. They're just going to be big, like we saw a long time ago with Standard Oil and those monopolies. But regulating private industry and the private sector through the government is also not going to work, because as you can see throughout history, wherever the government steps in, it doesn't always help the problem. It almost always makes it worse. And usually private people and private citizens can run their companies better than the government could. But on the other hand, you also can't have 3 or 4 companies controlling what information people hear and see every day in their lives. So that's a pretty complex problem. But personally, I don't think that regulating the private sector is going to solve it.
So briefly, before time runs out, whose responsibility is it then? Do we just have to accept that this is going to get worse and worse?
Well, the people we elect should fight for that once they see what's going on, but it's talked about a lot, not much is going on with it. And I mean, that's who's got to do it, because private citizens can't do it. When another alternative platform was around, it got put away by Google and banned from the App Store. So there's been attempts, but you need another source of help.
That's time.
I'm sorry.
Wonderful.
Just said was we're gonna have to stop there for time. Thank you very much. I thought your initial presentation clearly stated your positions. However, I'm going to say something about the practical effect of it. I don't know where your mics are, but when you're reading, you're looking down. So your voice is directed down. And it was difficult at times to understand you. And keep in mind that you read faster than you speak. So for the person who is processing what they're hearing, it's harder to understand what someone is reading out loud than what they are saying out loud. So I would just encourage you to perhaps look up a little bit more, maybe not look down quite so directly, because I think it would make the oral side of what you're saying present a little bit better. I liked that you were able to respond to how you thought these hearings were effective. You did have suggested solutions about limiting the size of government, which is a bold suggestion. There hasn't been a lot of discussion of that in the groups that we've seen. So you've obviously done a lot of work in this area, and it shows. And I don't think I heard, where is your high school located?
Laurel, Montana,
Yeah, but where in Montana?
Southern.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Andrew, do you want to give your comments?
Yeah, so this was a very well sort of trained and you presented your positions very well. I thought your opening statement was very interesting. The reference to the church committee, the Iran Contra committee. You know, not everybody agrees that the church committee did such a great job. There are many who will draw more or less a direct line from the church committee and what they perceived as a weakening of the intelligence agencies to 9/11. I take no position on that, but it's just, you know, another example of how sort of the lens or the filters that people put on these things is so different. I was intrigued by your statement that the oversight power is underutilized, and you had good statistics for that. I was waiting sort of to hear, well, sort of what we could do about it, which is why I asked the question I did. And I'm not sure you really, I mean, I'm not sure, it was sort of ironic. You, Savannah, you suggested sort of fewer federal employees or executive branch employees, but either you or one of your colleagues suggested more congressional staffers. And there's a certain disconnect there in terms of sort of why we would have more efficiencies if we cut the executive department but increased the legislative department. And I'm sure, unfortunately, it's a very provocative idea. It's a very interesting idea. I regret we only had 12, you only had 12 minutes to talk about it. If we had more time, I would have loved to sort of drill down with you on sort of how, specifics, as I'm sure that you'd be able to describe and sort of give more nuance to what you're suggesting. So I'm not rejecting your thesis, only it requires, it's easy enough to say cut the number of employees, but I guarantee you that people would not be able to disagree with respect to which departments or which agencies in those departments should be cut. And so we're sort of chasing our tail to a certain extent, getting into the same kinds of difficulties and partisanship that seems to sort of infect everything else. But in any event, having said that, I wish we had more time. I was very impressed. and I was very interested in your ideas and the way you presented it. So congratulations.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think there's a lot of really great things to say. I think that you had some very strong statistics, some very great supporting evidence, and your viewpoints and arguments were very clear. You stood by them. You took strong standpoints, and you really did support them. And I really appreciated that. And the conversation I felt like it was still continuing to ramp up as we reached the end. And I wish we could have continued to dig deeper into it. Now, on the side of constructive feedback, I want to say, I've said this earlier today as well. I think that the most important thing that students get out of We the People is not about learning how to publicly speak in public or do research or read, legal documents or even understand the processes or the Constitution. I think the most important thing that students get out of We the People is a understanding of the fact that there is so much nuance and so much depth to all of these issues on both sides. And I've always said that if your position sounds too close to either of the two parties, you probably are missing some information. And that goes to both sides, right? Now, I personally agree with you on a lot of the points you made. I agree that the executive bureaucracy is far larger than it should be. I also agree that there's far more legislation than there should be in very, very many areas. I think the level of regulation we have today in many areas is way past what it should be, both from executive regulations and from legislative regulation. So I'm not, saying I disagree with you on any of that, but I do think that you should continue to do more research and be more thoughtful as you grow and as you progress through your academic and professional careers in making sure that you really get the nuance and the difficulties, because nothing is as black and white as it often appears. Like I said, I agree with you on cutting a lot of these things out, but obviously to some extent there is a necessity for some level of executive agencies and bureaucracy. There is necessity for some level of legislative bureaucracy and for some level of laws. Towards the end there, we got to this point where you guys were saying, okay, well, we need to cut down the executive bureaucracy. We want to make bills smaller. We want to get rid of omnibus bills. Love that. That's a great point. Breaking up monopolies hasn't always been super successful. Regulating private markets hasn't always been super successful. But the fact is that we do have problems. Talking about the tech giants, talking about social media, talking about the control they have over the flow of information and public opinion. There are some serious, dangerous issues that we're dealing with as a society. And somebody has to be responsible for at least trying to make these better, to work on these things. And I think we kind of at the end came to an agreement that, well, that's probably Congress's job, but we didn't get to a point of like, okay, well, how do we do that? And I very much empathize with and to a large extent agree with the desire to cut down on a lot of the bureaucracy and the legislation that we have today. But I think that you need to try to temper that with acknowledgement of the nuance, the fact that something has to be done in certain cases, and trying to put together better guidelines and a better philosophy that our society can use when thinking about government. Because I don't think that either political party has it right. A lot of people think that the Democrats or the left are just trying to throw more money and more bureaucracy and more government power at all of the problems. And the Republicans are just trying to throw everything to the free market. And we see that maybe neither of those is really the appropriate solution. They're both both have merits and they both have negatives. So I would love to see just trying to figure out how we can come up with a solution that really logistically solves these problems. I don't mean to preach at you guys. I just, I hope that you take seriously the fact that we have to find solutions. We can't just continue to say, well, government isn't the solution and shrug our shoulders.
Okay, thank you very, very much. It's obvious the amount of work you put into this. Congratulations to your teacher and your parents. I look forward to the contribution you folks are going to be making to government as you go into your adult lives. Thank you.